Kelly asked me to frighten you, which is easy to do because the facts are extraordinarily frightening right now where we are. I would say it's almost certainly worse than you think. And I know everyone in this room thinks that it's bad. I would say it's almost certainly worse than you think. You know a lot about the acute fiscal crisis that we face right now. Over $16 trillion in debt, trillion-dollar deficits annually every single year that Obama's been president. Government spending now consuming greater than 24% of GDP each year that Obama's been president. Historical norm is right around 20%. On a track towards more of a European-style system. And we've gotten basically an acute debt crisis underway that's being masked by the fact that the Federal Reserve is flooding the banks with funny money and forcing interest rates down, which is nice if you're refinancing a home. It's terrible if you need to live on interest rates, and people can't get any interest income at all. Seniors are really suffering under this policy, and I think it's a matter of time before the Treasury bubble collapses like the housing bubble before it. It is an artificial, inflated bubble keeping even this acute episode of our debt from collapsing. And the $16 trillion in debt works out to a little more than $50,000 for every man, woman, and child in the United States. That's a lot of money from the day you're born to come into the world with. I've got 7-week-old twins. They've got $50,000 on each of their heads, which is kind of remarkable. But that's really just the tip of the iceberg. And that's the reason there's been so much talk about entitlement. That's why what Paul Ryan did, being willing to talk about the larger debt trends, were so important, because the official on-the-books debt is only about a fifth of the total unfunded liabilities that we've got. The Medicare program alone has an unfunded liability of in excess of $38 trillion. Social Security is above $20 trillion. So if you think that we can keep the promises that these programs have made without significant reforms, fundamental structural reforms, that means you think that we can basically put a burden on our children, not of $50,000 per person, but of $250,000 per person. And I don't see how that level of indebtedness is possibly compatible with any kind of economic future for our country. I don't think you can square that circle. So it probably won't happen because it can't happen, but a lot of broken promises and a lot of suffering are going to occur if we don't get out ahead of this. And we have very little time left, as baby boomers are already retiring in large numbers every single day. And so that's sort of the debt and deficit situation. Now, I think you were probably all very active fighting for the last 4 years against every bad idea that this administration put forward. And you get to this point where you say, wait, he won? Now we have to do all that over again? And it's sort of, but we do. We have to do everything we did in the past 4 years all over again, starting immediately. There's no time to take a break. There's no time to take a rest. And that's because this very first fight that we're in right now is the flip side of the stimulus fight that we lost. We only lost 2 fights in Obama's first term, 2 significant fights. We lost the stimulus and we lost health care. We beat cap and trade, we beat card check. We had considerable victories, much greater victories than we probably were entitled to, considering he had these huge majorities. But as activists, we engaged and stopped a lot of what he wanted to do. But what did we lose on? We lost on the stimulus, $800 billion, mostly to sort of fill the tank of the progressive liberal machine, the unions and the environmentalists and the cronies and the corrupt corporate donors and the rest of it. And that was a huge hit. And that, I think, largely contributed to his reelection, because there was so much money out there in all of these groups that were all very grateful, and they put it into organizing and so forth. Now, a million other things went wrong, so when it's a close election, you can blame it on just about anything. But now we've got the exact flip side of that fight. Now they want a huge tax hike to try to pay for this permanently elevated level of spending, and we've got to stop that. It's interesting, Obama the other day announced that he has a mandate for a $1.6 trillion tax hike, which is amazing, because I thought he was saying just pay a little bit more. I thought the official campaign mandate was to just pay a little bit more. Now after he wins, it's $1.6 trillion, and of course that will not get anywhere near bringing in 24% of GDP, which is the level of spending that we're at. So it's really just a foot in the door. He's trying to entice Republicans to destroy the only significant brand differentiation they have, which is they're the party that won't tax you. I mean, they'll both spend our money all day long on all kinds of wasteful stuff, unfortunately, but Republicans have been the party that won't raise your taxes. And that's why he's so desperate to get a foot in the door with a tax hike, first on the rich, then on the upper middle class, and then on the middle class and on the poor. And I think the next big tax fight that we're going to have after this current one, and I certainly hope we'll win this current one, but win or lose, of course, they'll either say we got the money for the rich, and it just wasn't enough, so we need a whole lot more, or they'll say, oh, we didn't get the money for the rich, now we really need to have a broad-based tax increase. I think that next year we are going to have a major fight in this country about a carbon tax. And they are going to propose a carbon tax. It's going to be very similar to what we had in the cap and trade fight. The difference is in cap and trade we had to expose that it was a secret tax. They're not even going to hide it this time. They're going to say we've got to have a carbon tax. This is the greatest thing ever. We can save the world from global warming. And at the same time, we can raise all the money that we want for all the government spending that we've got. The White House is pretending that they're not for this. They say, oh, we didn't propose a carbon tax. But the Treasury Department has an Office of Energy and Environment that has 7,300 emails about a carbon tax that they refuse to release under the Freedom of Information Act. And Chris Horner from CEI is suing them to try to get a hold of those documents. But why would you have 7,300 emails that you're trying to keep secret about a policy that you're not proposing? And I think the reason they're not proposing it is they're desperately hoping that some Republican will come forward and propose it first, and then they can say, see how bipartisan we are. We're willing to put this Republican idea in our compromise package. And we better make sure it doesn't happen. I fear that perhaps Susan Collins, who's supported things like this in the past, or other sort of left-leaning Republicans could make this happen. The American Enterprise Institute had an all-day conference on Tuesday in support of a carbon tax. They're a supposedly conservative think tank. That is a very negative indication. And one of the things that was very interesting, conservatives who say they want a carbon tax say, well, we'll use it to cut other taxes, so we won't raise your taxes. It'll be a tax swap. Don't worry, they're revenue neutral. But of course, once you get the new tax in, all the taxes go up, the old ones and the new ones. And the interesting thing is the AEI guys, the supposed conservatives who want a carbon tax, they actually had a slide in the slide deck they showed on Tuesday that said, in order to offset the regressivity, which is a Washington word for this is going to screw the poor, because it will, if you jack up gasoline and electricity prices, it hurts the poor a lot more than anyone else because more of their household budget goes to energy. They said in order to offset that, in order to offset the regressivity, we would only have to increase social welfare spending by 11% of the revenue that we raised. This is AEI. These are the Republicans already admitting that it would not be revenue neutral but would go to increased welfare spending. So I think we're going to have a rerun of the cap and trade fight. We won it last time. We can win it again this time. I hope that there will not be Republicans helping them out with that, but that's certainly going to be a fight. Spending. We've got to cut it. And frankly, the idea in Washington that a $109 billion cut, which is what's in the so-called fiscal cliff, a $109 billion cut in a $4 trillion plus budget is not a disaster. It's a very small start in the right direction. And we've got a real problem in that we spent years finally convincing people that spending is a problem. And this was a real failure of the Bush years. In the Bush years, we did a great job keeping taxes low, but spending went up and up and up, and we kind of said, well, as long as we're borrowing and spending instead of taxing and spending, it's fine. And that was a real problem. It hurt our credibility tremendously. And we made great progress on that, thanks to you guys. The Tea Party came in and said, no, I understand every dollar they spend, it's either coming out of taxes or it's being borrowed and we're going to have to pay it back later, or it comes from inflation. There's no free lunch. This is pretty simple stuff. But the real cost of government is spending, however they come up with the money. And so we've got to cut spending in order to get the fiscal picture under control. And yet a lot of Republicans running TV ads saying that my opponent wants these horrible, crippling cuts. And spending cuts are going to be a problem. I live in D.C., so my vote doesn't really count. I voted anyway for fun. But we had all these TV ads, in the Virginia Senate race. And I love George Allen a lot. I actually did a lot in that race to support him more on the coal issue. But you're seeing all these ads that say the reason not to vote for Tim Kaine is that he cuts education spending, which first of all wasn't true. But second, we shouldn't be attacking Democrats for wanting to cut spending. We should be wanting to cut spending a lot more than they do. And on the defense issue in particular, I think we made a big mistake. And it's not that we don't need to spend money on national defense. And I'm not an expert. I don't know if we need to be spending at the current levels higher or if we can afford lower in terms of national security. But we make an enormous error if we say the reason not to cut defense is that it's good for the economy to have defense spending, that there are people who work in these industries. That's true, but you could say that about every government spending program. This is what the Democrats always say. When they spend the money, then they have this job here, there's a multiplier. No, because every dollar that's spent came from somewhere. And it's just as true for defense spending as it is for any other kind of spending. Yes, you create a job when you spend it, but you destroy jobs when you take the money out of the economy on the front end through taxes, borrowing, or inflation. There is no free lunch, and defense spending is no different from non-defense spending in this regard. And we would have a stronger argument if we said we need this spending because it's necessary to protect this country and defend our national security, period. Not because it's also a jobs program. That weakens the argument, and it opens the door for the Democrats to come back and say, see, they were lying for the past 3 years when they said spending hurts the economy. It actually helps, and now they admit it. And so I think we had a huge backslide on that argument. We've got to get back on saying that spending is a bad thing, which it is. We've got the facts on our side. We've got the evidence on our side. Now, the tax and spending fights are enormous. They're daunting. But I'm going to scare you even more. The tax and spending fights don't matter at all if we don't stop regulation, because anything the government can do by taking your money and giving it to someone else or spending it on something, they can also do by ordering you what to do and regulating you. And they will do it by both. They're pursuing both paths right now. So if you stop one, it will mean nothing if you don't stop the other. And the very first thing in the United States Constitution after the famous We the People preamble, Article 1, Section 1, says all legislative power is vested in Congress. That means Congress writes the laws. It doesn't say legislative power is vested in the EPA and the IRS and the HHS and the FDA and every other alphabet soup agency out there. Bureaucrats and regulators cannot write the law. They do not have that authority. They do not have that power under our Constitution. And yet, for far too long, Congress has been complicit in the outsourcing of the legislative power that we have entrusted to them to these alphabet soup bureaucracies. The healthcare law is 2,700 pages of HHS and IRS. You guys figure it out. That is unacceptable. The Dodd-Frank law is another 2,000 pages of CFTC and SEC. You guys figure it all out. That is unacceptable. And quite frankly, we cannot have a state of affairs where when cap and trade fails, they say, no problem, we have the 1970 Clean Air Act, which lets the EPA go ahead and do it anyway. So we have got to get these laws under control that allow the bureaucrats to run wild. We need to exercise effective oversight on all these abuses of power that are going on. We need to use subpoenas. We need to use the power of shame to expose them in public. And we need to use the most important power that Congress has, which is the power of the purse. Because if they do not have the money for all of this regulatory mischief, they will be much less able to interfere in the private economy. We have an administration whose worldview is that they know better than we do how to run our lives, our homes, our families, and our businesses. They think that the elites and the experts and the bureaucrats and the university professors and the intellectual classes of Washington and New York are so much smarter than everyone else that people shouldn't be allowed to make their own decisions. If they do, they'll make the wrong decisions. They need someone looking over their shoulder every step of the way, telling them what to do and how to live, and that is fundamentally wrong. We must fight against it. I don't care what one election says. I don't care about the ebb and flow of politics. These are fundamental principles of human freedom, and they are worth fighting for. And I want to end with a quote that I think is very important. It's from someone I don't often agree with, but I think it's a very telling commentary on the election that we just had. And the quote goes like this: "Maybe peace would have broken out with a different kind of White House, one less committed to waging a perpetual campaign, a White House that would see a 51-48 victory as a call to humility and compromise rather than an irrefutable mandate." That's from Audacity of Hope, and he was talking about Bush's re-election in 2004. And we should not back down. We will not back down. We're going to have to fight it all over again. We're going to have to win these fights again, and we're going to have to save this country. Thank you so much for everything you do.